Hey there, I'm Bill and welcome to Project Build, where today we're renovating this old mantle to go from this to this. I'll start this project by removing the old fireplace surround. I scored the caulk lines where the molding meets the ceiling and carefully pried the molding off in an attempt to do as little damage to the existing drywall as possible. I did the same for below the mantle, except I wasn't as careful down there and I damaged a lot of the drywall while prying the surround off. Oops, just more things to fix later. I contemplated leaving the drywall that's above the mantle and building over it, but in the end, I decided that I didn't want this part sticking out further than it already does, so I tore out the old drywall here. I pried off the old marble, which took large chunks of the drywall with it. And then I pried up the old hearth, which was very heavy. And there was some caulk from the marble left behind on the metal of the fireplace, so I removed that with a scraper. The drywall behind the marble was too damaged to provide a suitable substrate for the new stone, so I cut out rectangular sections along the studs using an oscillating multi-tool. I put up new drywall, screwing it to the studs where possible. There's a metal lip on the top of the fireplace to attach to, so I first pre-drilled and then attached the drywall using fine thread screws that are made to attach drywall to metal studs. I applied adhesive joint tape to the seams and applied a few layers of joint compound to cover the tape and any low spots in the drywall. And once dry, I sanded it all smooth and put a coat of primer over the new drywall and joint compound. I used a wet paper towel to wipe off any joint compound I got on the metal of the fireplace and then lightly sanded the metal so that the adhesive I'm using for the fireplace stone will have a rougher surface to stick to. So before we go any further, I need to install a hearth here. There are lots of options for what the hearth can look like, but all are going to need to be made out of a non-combustible material. I think the easiest thing to do would be to continue the tile from the fireplace surround down and use the same tile for the hearth, but I'm not going to be able to do that since I'm using this ledgestone tile and it varies in thickness and it can really only be used for walls and not for floors. I went and looked at some slab hearths from my local stone yards and priced out a few of those, and they were all kind of expensive. So what I decided to do instead is make my own hearth from these porcelain tiles, but they're currently too big, so I'm going to have to cut those to size. The size requirements of a hearth will depend on your specific fireplace as well as your local building codes, so be sure to check on those. I've linked some resources in the video description that can help you to figure out what size hearth you need. My fireplace requires a hearth of at least 16 inches, and I decided to make mine a little larger than that. So I first marked the pavers at 18 inches for the depth with a construction pencil, and then cut them with a wet tile saw, going about halfway and then flipping the paver over to finish the cut. A sliding table tile saw would likely make these cuts a lot easier to manage, as the pavers were pretty large and difficult to cut on my saw. Then I cut each paver to a width of 20 1/4 inches so that with 3 pavers and 2 1/8 inch gaps in between, my hearth will be 61 inches wide. The cut is a lot smoother on the side of the tile that faces down, so I started the cut on one side of the paver to prevent that end from chipping off, and then flipped the paver over to do the majority of the cut. Back at the fireplace, I checked the floor to make sure it was level in all directions, and if it were significantly unlevel, I would have filled the low spots with leveling compound, but my floor was good enough to move forward. I found the center of the fireplace and continued that center line out across the floor. And I marked the 18-inch depth of my pavers out from the fireplace and drew reference lines for where the pavers will end, which will help me when applying mortar. To cut the 1/4 inch backer board that will go under the pavers to size, I marked it at 18 inches and scored the same line multiple times using a drywall square and utility knife. There are carbide blade scoring tools made specifically for this purpose, but if you only have a little to do like I do, you can get away with using a utility knife. I placed the edge of a board on my line, which helps to leave a clean edge, held that board down with my body weight, and snapped the backer board in two. I needed significantly less mortar than the full 50-pound bag it was sold in, so I calculated out the appropriate amount of water and mortar for slightly over 2 times the square footage of my hearth, poured in the water to a mixing bucket, and used a small scale to get the appropriate amount of mortar. I mixed the mortar using a spiral mixing arm on a drill per the instructions on the bag, and I recommend cleaning the paddle before the mortar dries, which can quickly be done by stirring it into a clean bucket of water. I used a tile trowel to apply the mortar to the floor, first spreading out a thin layer up to my reference lines I made earlier, and then dragging the notched ends of the trowel at about a 45-degree angle to the floor to create grooves in the mortar. I set down the backer board on top of the mortar and pushed it into position, aligning the center of the backer board with that center line I made earlier, and used some excess screws to space it out slightly away from the fireplace. I secured the backer board to the floor using 1 1/4 inch cement board screws made specifically for this purpose, driving them flush with the backer board at the designated locations every 8 inches apart. I applied some more mortar to the center of the backer board where my first paver is going to go, and then back buttered that paver using the flat side of the trowel to increase the bond strength between the backer board and the paver. I flipped the paver over, set it on the mortar bed slightly off to the side, and then slid it into position, aligning a center mark I made on the front with my reference center line. And I repeated to add the other 2 pavers using tile spacers to leave an 1/8 inch gap between the pavers. And before the mortar dried, I used a putty knife to remove any excess around the hearth. Before installing any stone around the fireplace, I removed the track for the fireplace doors as it sticks out slightly in front of the fireplace. You might have noticed that I updated the old gas fireplace, and I've got a separate video linked on how I did that if that's something you're interested in. I measured and marked the areas that will be covered by the stone around my fireplace, connecting my marks using a straight edge. And I aligned the edges of some scrap boards on my lines, tacked them in place temporarily, and then screwed them to the studs where possible to hold them securely. I wanted to figure out the layout of my stone before starting to attach them to the wall, so I cut some cardboard to size using a utility knife and drywall square and taped my cardboard pieces around the fireplace to make a template for where the stone will go. Using this template allowed me to lay out the stone and figure out the pattern ahead of time, which is important for a fireplace as I'll have to adhere the stone above the fireplace opening before the rest, which I'll explain more here in a minute. The tiles were a bit too tall for the bottom row, so I ripped off a small strip and then laid the cut tiles on my template. For the thin vertical strips on the side of the fireplace, I used a hammer and a flathead screwdriver to separate the stone sections from each other so I could cut these sections independent of the other. And doing this allowed me to have a lot less seams on these small vertical sections than if I had cut the larger pieces all at one time. I continued the pattern across the top, first adding a row of the larger stones, and then laid out the rest of the pattern. The tiles above the fireplace opening need to be set before those below, so I put a board in line with the top edge of the fireplace opening and then screwed it to the studs. And this board is necessary to support the stones over the fireplace while the adhesive cures. There's a lot of adhesive on the back of the tiles already, so I removed it with the scraper. If I was setting these tiles in mortar, this wouldn't be necessary, but mortar won't stick well to the smooth metal of the fireplace, so instead I'm using a high temperature rated sealant. I laid a bead about 1/4 inch in from the edge of the stone and then filled in the middle in a zigzag pattern. Then I began laying the first row on top of the board ledge. To ensure maximum adhesive contact, I set the stones just slightly off to the side and then slid them into place, similar to how I did with the pavers for the hearth. A few stones in, I realized it would be good to adhere the sides of the stones to one another, so I started adding a bead of sealant between them and then finished out the row. And I waited till the end to cut the last stone in the row, as this makes it easier to get a perfect fit. I put a bead on top of the row below and began installing the next row, being sure to apply sealant to the edges of any existing stone that will contact the newly added pieces. I cut the pieces for the last small row and then set those too. I let the sealant cure for more than 24 hours before daring to remove the support board, and after 24 hours I removed the screws and it didn't fall. Phew! Moving on to the bottom row, I shimmed the pieces to line up the top edges of the stones with the bottom of the fireplace opening and attached them the same as before. And then I added the pieces going up the sides. And my template wasn't perfect and there's a small gap at the top here, so before the adhesive began to cure, I slid all the side stones up and started shimming from the bottom. And this spreads that extra space out and it's much easier to hide the gaps down low since the stones will almost always be viewed from above. With the stone installed, it's time to actually make the fireplace surround. And I started this by ripping a 4x8 sheet of 3/4 inch plywood to 47 inches, which was the length of the longest piece that I need for my surround. And from that section of plywood, I ripped pieces for the horizontal apron of the surround, as well as 2 pieces for the faces of the legs and 4 pieces for the sides of the legs. Then I cut all those pieces to length on the miter saw. I drilled pocket holes along the long edges on the back side of both of the leg fronts, and then used lots of clamps to hold the two sides of the legs to the leg front. The height of the leg sides was causing the pocket screws to go in at the wrong angle, so I used a right angle adapter and a shorter bit to allow for better access. My surround legs are pretty narrow at just 7 inches wide, but if you make yours wider, you might not have the clearance issues that I did. I made trim for the surround by ripping a bunch of 2 1/4 inch strips from a sheet of 1/4 inch thick MDF and then cut them to length on the miter saw. I put one of the vertical stiles on the surround leg, spread wood glue with a brayer, and tacked it flush with the edge using a pen nailer. I repeated for the other side of the leg and then added a small horizontal rail at the top and bottom of the leg. After drilling pocket holes in the bottom of the large apron piece, I screwed on the apron lip, and then I flipped the apron over and added a rail to the bottom and top edges and a stile at each end of the apron. I added another small rail to the legs, and the bottom edge of this piece lines up with the bottom of the apron. I filled the seams and any visible nail holes with wood filler, and once dry, I sanded it all smooth with 220 grit on my orbital sander. I primed everything first, painting the corners with a brush, followed by a foam roller on the flat surfaces. And once dry, I hand sanded the primer with 320 grit sandpaper and then painted a coat of semi-gloss white on all the pieces. Back at the fireplace, I placed a scrap plywood spacer against the stone and screwed a couple of 2x4 blocks that are 1/16 of an inch less than the inside width of my surround legs to the studs there. And I temporarily placed the leg in place to mark the location of the top block and then screwed that block to the wall. Again, using a spacer, I screwed some plywood pieces to the studs that served to both hold the apron the correct distance away from the wall and give me something to attach the apron to. I test fit all the pieces, which allowed me to see that the left side surround leg was a little too low, so I shimmed it up level with the apron. I then center punched and screwed the surround legs to the blocks behind using small trim screws and attached the apron to the plywood blocks using the same screws. I filled the gaps around the fireplace surround with caulk and smoothed it out with a wet finger. It took many passes to remove the caulk where it touches the stone of the hearth. For the gaps between the stone and the surround, I filled them like normal, but I used a wet paper towel to remove the excess as I found that using my finger here smudged the caulk into the rough surface of the stone. I filled the screw holes with spackling, and after it dried, I wiped off the excess with a wet paper towel. I put a caulk backer rod in the gaps in the hearth and then filled them with gray caulk. Now you normally use grout to fill gaps between tiles, and if I had more than just the 2 gaps to fill, I would have done that, as getting the caulk to stay in the gap and look good was a whole lot of work, and I really don't recommend doing it this way. I used that same gray caulk to fill the gap between the hearth and the surround stone. My fireplace surround is designed to accompany a wooden beam mantel, and I made and installed one at this point. I've got a whole other video about how I did that if that's something you are interested in seeing. To finish the wall above the mantel, I first cut strips that were the same depth as the bump out and then glued and tacked those strips to a 1x4 piece with a brad nailer. I used a laser level to shine a line even with the edge of the surround below, and then aligned and attacked my edge pieces to the studs behind. I put up the bottom piece of shiplap and tacked it to the studs there. I caulked those small seams at the top that will be overlapped by the next row since they'll be inaccessible once it's installed, and then I added that next row. I wanted to note that you could tack the shiplap through the top where it will be covered by the next row, but it won't be held tight at the bottom without some method of attachment down there. And I obviously didn't do it this way, so I continued on creating lots of holes that I'll need to fill later. At the very top, I ripped some of the cut off leftovers to fill the small gap here. For my crown molding, I need to account for the gap that's left by the edge pieces sticking out farther than the shiplap, and the easiest thing to do would be to cut a spacer strip to fill that gap and bring the trim out level with the edges. I decided to make my life harder because, that's something I'm good at, and I cut a rabbet on each end of the trim piece. It took a lot of adjustment and time to get it to fit right, and it was in no way worth it. Don't be like me. Once I finally got to put up the trim board, I put it level with the shiplap below and tacked it in place. And you might notice that the ceiling is very much not level. I'm constructing my crown molding here from multiple pieces, and that allows for some flexibility when working with unlevel ceilings. I used a 1x6 on the wall surface and put a 1x4 up against that board on the ceiling. And I caulked all the gaps and filled all the nail holes just like I did with the fireplace surround earlier, and then put a final coat of paint over everything. And we're done renovating this fireplace surround. If you want to do the same to your fireplace, free plans as well as all the tools and materials used are linked down in the video description. If you liked the video, be sure to give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing so you won't miss my future videos. Until next time, go build yourself and update your fireplace.